All right. So, what happens when an offender violates their conditions, whether it be general or specific? So, there are two types of violations that an offender can have. The first is a technical violation. Now, if we think of these conditions of probation in terms of contracts, the offender signs a contract agreeing to these either special conditions and or general conditions to stay out of trouble in lieu of going to jail or prison. And so a technical violation would be a violation of one of the contractual terms. So they failed a drug screen, or they were late for curfew, or they didn't pay their fees. Those all fall under technical violations. The second form of violation is known as a legal violation. And a legal violation is exactly what it sounds like. It is a new legal charge. So they have broken the law, which can fall under a technical violation because a general condition is not to commit any new offenses. But a legal violation is breaking the law completely and catching new charges. Now, what happens when they commit one of these two types of violation? Well, probation officers have the discretion in most cases on how to handle violations. And typically, you're looking at technical violations, how they handle technical violations. So it can range from like informal warnings to not do that again. They can be given new tasks, all the way up to something called revocation. And that essentially means that the probation is going to be revoked, or the option of being in community corrections and having your case handled in community corrections goes away, and you're going to serve the rest of your term out in prison. Now, as we've talked about these violations, it's important to remember that the majority of people successfully complete their probation in community corrections. We measure success rate in recidivism, and recidivism is generally lower in probation than it is in incarceration. So remember, if we're comparing the options of community corrections to incarceration, you have higher recidivism rates from people released from prison than you do from people who are supervised in the community under community corrections. Now, research also shows that there are certain personal characteristics that are tied to successfully completing community correction sanctions. So these individuals, or individuals who have these type of characteristics, tend to have lower recidivism rates. So women are more likely to successfully complete community corrections. If the individual is married or has some strong social bonds in the community, they're more likely to successfully complete their probation. Those with jobs and those who are older typically successfully complete community corrections. So, again, those personal characteristics, women, married, or have some strong social bond, older people, those who are employed, and those who have some type of higher education levels. So now let's turn our attention to probation officers. And probation officers are known as the arm of the courts because essentially they are the court's fact finders. They are the eyes and ears of the court. And their role is to ensure that um, the court conditions are met, and supervise the offender through their sentence. Now, there's a huge role conflict with probation officers. Um, in adult probation, they are post certified officers, which means they can arrest, they carry guns, all of that. In juvenile, it's a little bit different. There are some sections of juvenile probation that carry guns and can arrest and are post certified. Others fall under the social work umbrella. But there's this consistent role conflict between law enforcement and social work that probationers feel or probation officers feel, because I can tell you from my time as a probation officer, the majority of my job was what is called case management. And case management is really the social work aspect of the job. So that's linking the client to services they may need in the community, like treatment, mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, um, getting them engaged in pro social activities, things like that. But then, as a probation officer, you are enforcing the law and enforcing the court order and can arrest them. And so there's a constant battle that probation officers feel of, what role do I fit in this system? Some favor law enforcement more, and they are drawn to being a probation officer or community corrections because of that law enforcement aspect, not realizing there's a whole case management and social work aspect to this job, because you're dealing with people and helping people. Now, I did mention this a little bit earlier, but adult probation officers especially carry weapons. And the reason that they do that is because there have been rising assault rates with probation officers. And so it's kind of forced them into the role of having to carry weapons. We saw these especially in New York City and St. Louis, Missouri, were two examples of where probation officers who were not armed were assaulted, potentially killed, and that caused some concern about safety. Now, that again, different people have different opinions. I came from the juvenile realm, and in the juvenile realm, it's very rehabilitative, is the focus, and so you fall more in the social work leg of it. When I left the Department of Juvenile Justice, they were transitioning into having their intensive probation units become post certified and carry weapons. I did not particularly want to do that because I liked the social work aspect more than I liked the gun. So there's this constant identity crisis between probation officers about where they fit in the system and what their role is. And those that are successful find a balance in between. They hold offenders accountable, but understand their role in case management. So, what do probation officers do? Well, probation officers do a wide variety of things. So you see that probation officers typically do pre-sentence reports, which is basically an aggregation of the facts um, that they gathered during the pre-trial investigation. So for a probation investigation, they will do an investigation of the offender, gathering positive and negative information about offenders' lives and community ties. It's kind of a biosocial history of the offender, and then they put that into a report for the judge. And in that report, it will tell the background of the offender, any mitigating circumstances that the offender might have encountered. There's a growing trend to recognize childhood trauma and kind of adverse childhood experiences. They're called ACEs. In juvenile realm, that's very important that we recognize and take that into account when we're dealing out accountability, because especially with kids, brains aren't fully developed until your mid 20s. So the pre-investigation or the pre-sentence probation investigation report is a big duty for probation officers. But once an offender is formally sentenced to probation, then the probation officer have to assess their level of risk of reoffending. So there's a lot of risk assessment and classification that goes into this. So when we talk about risk assessment, we talk about what is the offender's propensity to commit new crimes or harm themselves. And so we have different tools, risk assessment tools that we utilize that take into consideration like previous criminal history, employment, socioeconomic status, things like that. There are two major types of risk predictors. The first is a static risk predictor. And a static risk predictor is a risk predictor that cannot be changed. So, age at first arrest, you can't change that. The number of prior arrests, the number of times a person has been incarcerated in the past, that's all static risk predictors because those can't change. You can't go back in time and change when someone was first arrested. But then you have something known as dynamic risk predictors. And dynamic risk predictors are those characteristics that are amenable to change. So, such as employment status, education level, and peer groups. So we can help an unemployed offender become employed. So when we're assessing um, that dynamic, that's known as a dynamic, or that yeah, that dynamic, that's considered a dynamic risk predictor. So static cannot change, like your criminal record. Dynamic can change. So we also talked a little bit about classification. And probation officers determine the level of supervision appropriate um, for the offender. And they take into consideration this whole determining the level of appropriate supervision is known as classifying them. Are they going to be high level supervision? Are they going to be low level supervision where they only need to be seen once a month because they're not as likely to reoffend? Um, you typically have a recommendation. So you'll do your assessing and classifying in your pre-sentence report and submit that recommendation to the judge. Then once they're sentenced to probation, there's typically a system that probation officers go into based on where they work. So like this state DCS has their own system. When I worked for DJJ, we had our own risk assessment tool that we utilized that I would go in and like click buttons about age at first offense and um, family dynamic and peer any gang affiliations, things like that. And it would tabulate all of your inputs and would tell you what risk uh, that offender should be supervised on. And then supervision is one of the largest duties of the probation officer. So, supervision is the duty to watch over the offender. Your book goes into great detail about diversity issues in community corrections. Something that I want you to make sure you're aware of is females make up a low proportion of the incarcerated population relative to their presence in the population. So, um, we know that corrections is made up majority by males. And then in 2016, being like looking at community corrections specific, 55% of those serving community corrections were non-Hispanic white. Um, we know the diversity issues are more severely, though minorities are more severely targeted for incarceration as opposed to their white counterparts, which are typically given community corrections according to um, empirical research. Now, let's look at those who are working as probation officers. So, what is the diversity like in our community corrections agencies? Well, diversity isn't really tracked in terms of um, probation officer dynamics. We do know that most probation officers are white, middle class individuals. Uh, and we do know that just like pretty much all other social domains, female officers experience different stress levels than men. They have to deal with um, different viewpoints of their existence in in the community. So we know that some females may experience discrimination based on their sex, of people saying, "Well, you can't really adequately supervise uh, felons. You're just a woman." Things like that. So those diversity issues creep into the practitioner side as well. And then finally, your book highlights the technology issues. Much like every other social domain in our existence today, the use of technology has increased along with the number of offenders uh, becoming involved in community corrections. This has led to this dynamic of increased caseloads and not having enough people to actually supervise the offenders. So, what happens when that happens? Well, we typically will turn to technology to help alleviate some of that. So, something that's very interesting and really kind of controversial right now is a tool known as automatic kiosk reporting. And basically, these are freestanding machines that probationers go to and log in. And the high tech ones have like eye scanning technology, things like that. But that's how they check in. Instead of seeing an individual probation officer, they go to a kiosk and log into the machine. Um, Again, highly, highly controversial. There's always the debate of if we're moving toward that domain, what does that mean for the job of the probation officer? But then we also utilize technology to help with the supervision. So we recognize that the importance of still having a person supervise and kind of deal with that case management aspect of probation, that social work aspect of probation. But we may need them to lean on the technological advances to help monitor. So, a probation officer has to sleep. A probation officer has more than one person on their caseload. In fact, most of them have probably 50 to 100, if not over that. And so, utilizing tools like GPS monitoring or RFIDs um, help increase supervision of the individual offender while the probation officer themselves can focus on other tasks. So technology is a great thing, and has really kind of increased productivity and increased what can kind of increase the streamlining of the duties of the probation officer. Um, I don't think that it would ever that the profession would ever go away. Um, I think that you're always going to have high level offenders that need that case management aspect. And a machine can't do the case management aspect. So, automatic kiosk reporting is great for low level offenders. There is a status known as non reporting status, um, which means that the offender has probably been on probation for a while, probably successfully completed the majority of their probation. They may still owe fees or something like that. So they're placed on something called non reporting status where they don't have to come in monthly. They may can call in or may can go to these automatic kiosks to report in at a specific time. But they don't really need to take up the time of a probation officer to micromanage them like some of the other higher risk probationers would. All right, so that concludes our lecture on community corrections. I hope you all have a great week. Make sure you do the quiz for this week, and then we will come back together next week and talk about institutional corrections and prison life. So, as always, if you need anything, feel free to reach out. Bye.